Hello, friends. Welcome back to Heartforward, Conversations from the Heart. Today, we are going to launch into Season 2, and I am delighted to share an interview I had with Barbara Wilson, licensed clinical social worker. I especially hope the young people entering the profession of helping people, whether it be through social work or clinical practice, would strap on their earbuds to listen to today's California history lesson. Barbara helps to connect the dots on how a system of support through a network of case managers or good old-fashioned social workers started strong in the 1970s in California as the state hospitals were being emptied, and then unraveled in the 1980s and 90s. You will hear how the discretion afforded to professionals like Barbara, who was assigned and felt accountable to a caseload in the 90044 zip code, was eventually eroded and replaced with rules and bureaucracy and risk management. The people suffered, and the institution won. Having Barbara describe how she had the freedom to care for people assigned to her in the 1970s reminds me of what I observed in Trieste. I didn't see anyone chained to a desk or endlessly documenting interactions in Trieste. They were out and about, always on the move, problem solving, partnering, coming alongside their clients and their families. They felt accountable. We can do this in America. Apparently we did. Oh, good morning, Barbara. It's so great to see your face on this sunny March day in Los Angeles. I really wish we could be together doing this, but that will happen sometime this year. I know I get to see you again. And I'm thrilled to have you as part of the Heartforward podcast. And I've been so looking forward to having this discussion today because I feel like every time I talk to you, I learn so much. You have been a mentor, you have been a historian, and you are just a tireless, passionate advocate for improving services to people with serious mental illness in our community. So I'm delighted to share you with the listeners to this podcast. So welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, I want to start, Barbara, kind of with your origin story. You and I in this community mental health system unraveled in California over the last 50 years. So you're going to be our tour guide for that because you've been right in the midst of that. But let's go back. Let's start with you. When you started to think about going into social work as a career, give us a little sense of your origin story, maybe where you were from, where you were educated, and why did you choose to get into this field?
Well, that's an interesting question and one I haven't really much thought about. So I grew up in Jim Crow South. I was in high school when the civil rights, the sit-ins and all that started. In fact, some of those people were they were college students, but they were children of people that my family knew. We used to live in Greensboro, North Carolina, and my father was a college professor at North Carolina A&T. And the way it is when your father is a college professor and he's African-American is every time he gets a promotion, you move. And so we moved a lot and we lived a lot of different places. So we had just moved away from Greensboro, North Carolina, where my mother was a public school teacher. The following year, the sit-in started. So while I was not a part of that, God forbid, I was a daughter. I'm an only child of a very Christian family, which means you don't do anything unless the adults say you do it. I still was very aware that things were not right. I was very aware of Jim Crow. I grew up knowing that no matter how bad you have to go to the bathroom, you just don't go because nobody's going to let you use the bathroom. And so that was kind of the environment. Everything was racially divided. And so my parents, to their credit, let me, I call it escape from the South by going away to college. And I went to college in the Midwest. When I graduated, my mother's requirement was I had to get teaching credentials. I knew I did not want to teach because I come from a family of teachers, 5 generations of teachers. So that was my rebellion. I didn't know what else to do. And I was looking for a job. And one of my college friends said, well, there's this hospital that's hiring. And I went, great, doing what? And it was a social work job. Unbeknownst to me, I was the first colored social worker they ever hired.
What year would that have been, Barbara?
That's about 1967.
Okay.
And they had just taken down the sign. Also, I didn't know this, that said state asylum for idiots and the feeble-minded.
Oh my goodness.
So that was the language of that time. And, it was a state hospital, and that was public mental health. That was the way it was delivered. And my job was to start to move people off of what they call the back wards. That is not to be meshed together, it's to say backwards. Back wards, those were wards of maybe 60 women or 60 men that basically they were stabilized. They were not expected to get a whole lot better. Some of them had lobotomies that failed. And so, you could always recognize them because they would just sit and smile all the time. And you could just look in their eyes, nothing was there. So many of those people had lived their entire adult life. I can just tell you one lady that I moved, she had come to the United States as an immigrant from the Bolshevik Revolution. And so we can just imagine in today's language, she would have been called traumatized, probably PTSD. She did not speak the language, of course. And so someone decided that she was mentally ill, and they put her in the state hospital. And she stayed in the mental hospital from about 1918 until 1968 when I moved her. So that was her entire adult life that she lived. And of course, she had been involuntarily sterilized because that was national policy. That wasn't just state policy. So, I mention all this stuff to just so that people can get a context of the state of mental health at that time. And this was our best thinking, guys. We thought we were doing society a favor. If you sterilize people, then you don't have to worry about ever having mental illness again, because the people that have it can't reproduce. And see how did that turn out. So that's how I started. And along the way, we started to have a lot of hope. There was legislation passed on the federal level under President Kennedy, actually, but by the time it got implemented, it just about hit me. And so I did my master's thesis on something called community mental health. I was a forerunner, I was doing my master's thesis. I interviewed school-aged children between the ages of 9 and 12 that had been told that they could not come to school until they got a psychiatric evaluation because the teacher or somebody decided that they had mental illness. So they had this long wait because by that time I was in graduate school at MPI, different state. I think almost every state has an MPI.
And what school was that?
That was in Nebraska.
Okay.
Neuropsychiatric Institute. And I was so excited to be chosen to do my field work there because it was like going to Nirvana to work with these magnificent professors and doctors and, because we were a part of the medical school. So I was training with people that were going to be psychiatrists and psychologists. I was very excited, but I had this burr of I wanted to take psychiatry out of the ivory tower and into the neighborhoods. And so my research was with these kids that had been excluded from school and told that they couldn't come back until they got this magical psychiatric evaluation. So I talked to the children, I talked to the teachers, and I talked to the parents to see what was it they understood. Why was their kid out of school? And so that was my research. So I've always sort of had an interest in what was happening in the streets, so to speak, as opposed to sitting in what I refer to as an ivory tower.
So that was an MSW. That's a master's in social work you got
Right.
in Nebraska.
Right.
How did you make your way to California?
Well, what do all good girls from the 60s do? And if you're from the South, you don't just go cross country because you feel like it. There has to be a hymn. I was actually working in Denver, and I discovered that the guy that I had a crush on in high school, he was just finishing his master's in Atlanta. I decided that we were soulmates. And so I was off and running, and I let him catch me. And so one of us had to move. I had to be willing to move to LA, or he had to be willing to move to Denver. That's how I got to California.
What's kind of cool to think about that is I was living in Denver at that time. So one of these days we'll have to compare notes about.
Yeah, I worked at a place called Fort Logan. And what attracted me, actually, I left a high-end corporate job where I was making significantly more money than I would make as a social worker. But I had heard Max Logan speak at MPI about the therapeutic community. And I was intrigued at the notion of how could you have a hospital and have no locked doors? So I very much wanted to work in that environment, and I was fortunate to get hired there. And so I worked in a few units. That was how I was able to design our first day treatment program, because remember, everything had been hospital-based, and we were proposing to move everything that we did in the hospital into the community. And the state was like, what? No, you can't do that. You have to have someone at the hospital. So that's what we did. We created a whole different way of delivering services. We had to find a place that didn't charge rent so that we could do that and have it be accessible by public transportation to residents in downtown Denver. You know, Denver is the opposite of LA County. You have 5 counties in the city of Denver. LA, you have one huge county and all these different towns. So politically, it's very different. So that's where I was when I came out to California.
I think I hear about those aspirations of the 60s with President Kennedy signing the
We did wonderful things. Do you know that before President Kennedy's legislation, when I came into the field, families that had a child that had retardation was not allowed to go to school. The family kept them home and they just rocked and, did whatever self-stimulation they did, but they didn't get any better than the family could get them better. And if they lived in an area where there was very few resources, well, so be it. And actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's really the Reagan philosophy of mental health is don't spend any taxpayer money on these people. They should be the responsibility of the families.
We're going to talk about the 80s in a moment. We're going to move into the 70s because as you and I kind of pre-chatted about this interview, what I love about your stories from the 70s is that there actually was a system of social work in California.
Oh, absolutely.
The true sense of the word. And you were a social worker, which seems to have disappeared from our array of services. So describe what it was like to be a social worker working in this field in the 70s in California before things started.
Well, to be specific, I was a psychiatric social worker. And I mention that not because I'm better than, but because a lot of people, when they hear the phrase social worker, they have kind of a stereotype of either it's somebody that takes children away from parents that shouldn't take that action, or they work in the welfare system. And I've never worked in either one. Almost all of my years in social work has been in some aspect of mental health. And what's unique about psychiatric social work is that we take the teachings and trainings of therapeutic techniques, but we also look at what's going on in the person's community, in their culture, in their faith, what's their value system. And we try to bring that together in a way that says, okay, what's working for you? Let's talk about what's not working for you, and let's see if we can help you fix that. And maybe what that is something that is outside of the person's scope. Maybe it's something in the culture that really needs to be changed in order to help that person. And so that's what I love about psychiatric social work is that we don't always just focus on the individual. We look at the individual, but at the end of the day, if this is a bigger problem, then we focus on the bigger problem too. And we will walk with that person if they lack the skills or they lack the resources and say, come on, if you want to change this, we're right here with you to partner, to walk with you through this journey. And I noticed that the older I've gotten, I've found so much solace in that. I've volunteered with different organizations, and I see how their staff will get right up to the point of going, oh, this is a big problem, that this is something that needs to be changed. But then they go, oh, but we don't dare speak about that.
Right. So it strikes me as I hear about this kind of like whole person approach, this therapeutic approach and coming alongside people. This is what they were doing in Italy also in Trieste. And the thing is, they never stopped doing it. So they continue to do it and they don't let people languish and fall through the cracks, and they support them in all their needs. Oh, and let me ask you one question. As a psychiatric social worker, is that what an LCSW is? Do you have to get a special credential?
Well, at the time that I started, back in the Stone Age, we didn't have licenses. They had not been invented yet. We had something, if you were a member of the National Association of Social Workers, there was a nationwide examination that you could take that would give you a credential that you could use that was recognized in all states for practice. But keep in mind, most of us were not in private practice. Most of us were working in agencies, either private agencies or public agencies, or some people might have been working in private hospitals. The private practice piece of it hadn't become what it is today. And so I got my license really because it was in 1980. I got my license because I saw that things were starting to change and I wasn't sure how things were going to go. And I wanted to work closer to home. I had small children and we were living in the suburbs and there were very few resources available for me to help me with my children. So I thought maybe I should start looking for a different job in an agency where I could be closer to my children.
Okay, so let's go back to the 70s, because the way I recall you telling me about the work you did, I think I remember you saying that you were actually assigned to a very specific geographic area in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Tell us about that work, because it seems like we are missing that now.
Oh, absolutely. So the way that system worked was, first of all, it was a statewide system. It had very little administrative layers. There was Sacramento, and then there was North and South California, and then there were, several offices in leased space. And in those offices, we were assigned by zip code. So when I worked in Los Angeles, for example, my zip code was 90044. So everything that happened in that zip code, which was about the Harbor Freeway west to about Normandy and Slauson South, everything that happened in that zip code came to me. First of all, I got to know the neighborhood really well. You get to know what are now called influencers, the pastors of the neighborhood, the big churches, the police that serve that district. You go out on enough pet calls and you get to be friends with a lot of people. But also we were responsible for creating things, because remember, when we're bringing people out of the state hospitals, there's nothing in the community to serve them. So we're going door knocking, going to churches saying, would you give us some space once a week if we bring some people in? We started forming things called friendship circles, where we get people in what are now called boarding care homes. They weren't called boarding care homes then. So we started a cooking group. We had a stove in our office, and one worker decided, wouldn't it be nice if people could get motivated to regain some independent living skills? Because remember, everybody's coming out of the hospitals.
I realize I missed an important question here, because, and maybe you can help make that segue, that this was during the era where people were coming out of the state hospitals, similar to the experience that you had in Nebraska. And now they're coming back to their community, and you are basically assigned a caseload of folks who are re-entering the community. Right. Okay.
Both people with mental illness and with retardation.
Their developmental disabilities.
Developmental disabilities. And you had to have relationships with the community, because the community was not really feeling positive about having these people return to the communities. And that included some family members. A lot of family members had gone through the decision to place their loved one in a state hospital, had been very, very difficult for them to come to. And now that they were there, they're like, what do you mean, bring them back? Bring them back where? To live with us?
This is like a piece of the puzzle I just never really fully grasped. So let's use 90044 as an example. Maybe you can even think back to a particular story where this person came out of this community. We're sending them back to this community. And if the family did not want to take them into the home, what was the alternative? How did that work?
We developed what is now called boarding care homes. We recruited, our agency specifically, one of our functions was to recruit people with a good heart, and they had to be self-supporting. So these typically tended to be people that were maybe early retirees that had decided that they wanted to give back to the community. So they were not financially motivated because they had to prove they had 3 months resources. And once we approved them, they were assigned a social worker like me. That social worker did all the screenings of any placements for them, all the paperwork, but also the social worker made sure that the clients were safe, that they were protected, that the facility owner was being good to them, being kind to them. Because if they weren't, we had the authority to move them out.
Barbara, this just seems like a huge job. Were there a team of you in the 900? No. And what would happen if something happened at 10 o'clock at night? There's no cell phones back then, but how?
No, there were no cell phones. That's right. I'll tell you, we had monthly staff meetings and we would have speakers come in. So one month we had speakers come in from Southwest Division of LAPD. And so, we're trying to make nice with them to make them know who we are. So when we're out on a call, if we call them for backup, they'll kind of give us a little priority and not shine us on. That was our hidden agenda. And the guy said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You guys are going out to people's homes and you know that they have mental illness, serious mental illness, and you're going out? And we went, uh-huh. And he said, and you're going out by yourself, not in a team? Uh-huh. He said, without a walkie-talkie? Well, uh-huh. He said, you guys are the ones that are crazy. Your patients are fine. And so, yeah, we did everything by ourselves. Mm-hmm.
Barbara, I think what's so interesting about this model that the state had put in place, it reminds me of what I saw in Trieste. They call it a micro area. And they take a very specific catchment area, and there is an assigned social worker. I saw this. I stayed for a whole day in one of these micro areas. Lunch is served there for people who want to wander in. But this woman knew everybody in the micro area. This one day I was there, they were really worried because this one elderly man did not show up for lunch. He hadn't been there for 3 days. So she arranged to have someone go check on him. It was truly like a safety net, a social safety net. And so you're telling me that in the state of California, throughout the entire state, there was a network of like the Barbara Wilsons of the world.
That's right.
Maybe in other areas, they were assigned a larger area because there's, more people in the 90044 zip code than there is in like rural Tehama County. But we had a network of safety net social workers.
And let me just tell you how it really functioned. If I, in my zip code, because I later transferred to a different area, I had a client who had serious mental illness. He was pretty stable, He had a yearning to go live by the ocean. It was no big deal. I just called our South Bay office, got the worker there to know that I had this client who needed to come down there. She found a bed in a boarding care home that was licensed. I drove him down to meet that worker and to preview, not just move in, preview the facility, meet the owner, get a feel for things. We drove back, and on the way back, of course, we talked about what had we just experienced. And he decided to take that bed, moved him down to the South Bay area. I kept the case for 3 months to see if it would stick. When he passed the 90-day mark, I transferred the case to the worker down there. She had, therefore, all of my notes. So she wasn't operating from the blind. She had all the physicals, all the labs, all the everything was in the chart. It transferred immediately. And that was statewide. So if he had wanted to go to Salinas, we would have done the same thing. We lost all of that.
So let's now cross the threshold into the 1980s, which I know you've described as the decade of the unraveling. And it's just so distressing to hear what happened. So I know that you told me, and this is kind of like the seminal aspects of that decade, but there was an opportunity now for counties to opt out of this state mental health system, this fabric, this safety net you're talking about, and assume those responsibilities within the county. But they were supposed to provide the same level of coordination and care.
They signed a document saying that.
So tell us what happened in LA County.
Well, first of all, to be fully transparent, each county opted out. And so the counties opted out at a different rate. They didn't all opt out at the same time. LA County was one of the last counties to opt out. And LA County signed an agreement saying that they would continue to service, we had to give them a roster of our cases and a roster of our workers and how many cars we had and all of that. And that everything would stay as it was or get better. What happened was immediately LA County decided, they had different regions and it was up to each region how they would use our services. So right away, there was an immediate unraveling. Also, from the county's perspective, what they saw, I think, now I don't know because I was not in administration, but I got the feeling that what they saw was here is a bucket of trained LCSWs, because by that time we all had a license. And so why don't we use them in our clinics? Because that will generate immediate revenue, billable hours. Case management somehow got separated. What we did for the state was what in today's time would be called a combination of therapy and case management. We did not separate the two. But the county, I guess due to funding, whatever they had to go through, they separated case management from therapy. So now you have a therapist that sits in the office all day, and you have a case manager. That's the person that goes out and finds you a board and care home. So right away you have a disconnect. Then you have each region within the county, the Department of Mental Health, deciding how do they want to use our services.
I think I may have said the 70s a moment ago. This is the 1980s. How did you feel about that? Here you have had this integrated role of case management and therapy. You're trying to meet the full needs of the persons that are assigned to you. Now it's bifurcated. I take it you now were sent to a clinic, so you're not out in the field anymore. How did that feel?
And the field time that I spent, the organization that I was assigned to had really no understanding of what field work was about, so they were very suspicious of it. I remember one time my immediate supervisor asked me, so just what do you do when you're out in the field? Kind of said it like, ugh. And so I made it what I thought was a joke. Wrong. I said, I go shopping at Nordstrom's of Little Rock. And she goes, I didn't know there was a Nordstrom's in Little Rock. I'm like, there isn't. I thought it was a humorous thing because, but she didn't think it was terribly funny. It wasn't a very good look.
It strikes me in that comment, and we've seen this play out even more, Barbara. You went from the discretion that you had in the 70s to exercise your discretion to meet the needs of people as you saw them. Like I'm even hearing driving that guy to the South Bay, which right now could be like a insurance violation or whatever, but you had discretion. And then the discretion is diminished a little bit more. There's like a lack of trust that you would be responsible in your field time. This is like the beginning of, if you can't trust your caseworkers to do what they need to do to help people.
That's a really good point. I had not thought of that in that respect, but you're absolutely right. Not only that, the amount of paperwork just grew. We went from a fairly lean organization in terms of paperwork. We had a little notebook that's maybe, 5 by 8 or something like that. That was like our Bible. We had everything that we was doing with the client. We had all the clients' identifying information. And why? Because if you're out in the field and you call for your messages and you find out that somebody's in crisis, now you've got to drop everything and go to that crisis. If you get to the crisis and you have to call for backup, they're going to ask you, what's the person's name, date of birth, and social? I don't have time to go to the office, to the clinic and say, I need this information. So you have it with you all the time. The minute we became county employees, they were like, you can't take that with you in the field. That's proprietary information. You have to keep it in the record. Well, where's the record? You can't keep records in your office. You have to keep them in administrative parts. So now you got to walk back and forth just to get a client's chart. We got to where it took 13 forms to open a case. Some of them asked for exactly the same information over and over and over. It took 2 hours to open a case for somebody that we already knew. Whereas when we were with the county, we had one piece of paper back and front. That's all there was for opening a case. We had one piece of paper for keeping track of when a person moved. And, where did they move to? And we could place them in any boarding care home that was licensed, that was suitable for their needs. They didn't have to have a contract with the state. The county, now they had their own contracts, and, you had to have X number of dollars in order to have the contract. And so that froze out a lot of the small facilities. And then speaking back to trust, there was an inherent kind of mood, I want to say attitude, among many of the County Department of Mental Health workers that was highly suspicious of boarding care operators, that viewed them kind of like they're out to take advantage of the residents. And they perpetuated that mistrust by when they would make a home visit. Many times they would closet themselves in the room with a client. So they would come in, see the client, and leave, never acknowledging the staff, never saying, I'm here to see John. As opposed to the way we worked, we saw the boarding care operators as an essential part of the treatment team because they're with them all the time. So when we make a home visit, we're going to talk to the boarding care operator and say, how's John been doing? Anything unusual happening? Okay, then you go and talk to John. And then on your way out, you're going to go back and see the operator and go, hey, John and I, maybe you and John together say, we were talking and he's concerned he only gets 1 cup of coffee in the morning and he'd really like to have free refills. Is there something we can do to fix that? Because you want to always take the client's concerns to the operator with the client. Otherwise, the client may, after you leave, get very guilty about what he has shared and blame it all on you. Oh, Barbara said blah, 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 blah. And I tried to tell her, no, I'm happy here, just like it is. So, there's a special way of working with facility operators. And most of the county workers did not do that. They didn't have that skill. And to be honest, they didn't have that interest because many of them, at the time that we came over, they were not accustomed to working with people that had serious and persistent forms of mental illness. They did more school age stuff and giving speeches, not to diminish what they did do, but they just were not really experienced in the client population that we were. And now they have been forced to become more involved with that population.
That decade, I've always heard how the California mental health system changed so much in the 80s with Reagan and whatnot. I never quite fully grasped the nuances of that. But what you're talking about is a gradual erosion of trust, of discretion, of holistic care for people, looking at the person's whole context, their culture, their living situation, and then a upswing in bureaucracy, in documentation, in risk management. And in that confluence, that is where I think the bottom dropped out. As I hear you describe your work, this is what they do in Trieste. They still do it. So it shows we are capable of this. We let the genie out of the bottle. And if we could go back and revisit the way you were tasked to care for people holistically, it is possible to do.
It's absolutely possible to do it. We're doing it at Mental Health Hookup today.
We'll come to mental health hookup in a minute. At some point here, you got a bit frustrated, as I could completely understand, and decided to retire from the system. Tell me about that decision, and then tell me about when you came back, because you said when you came back and saw almost like the aftermath of a war, what was left.
It was terrible. Well, I left, took an early retirement because I just felt like I had so many fingers in the dike and I just didn't have enough fingers left to save the clients that I cared deeply about, their families I cared deeply about. Many of the clients that I worked with them for maybe 10 years. There were families that I worked with. I worked with the mother and I knew the grandmother. And then eventually the children grew up. And so I helped them get summer jobs so that they could, be self-sufficient. So, you're not part of the family, but you certainly know the family and the family knows you. And so they know when something goes wrong, they know where to start. They recognize that Barbara may not have the answers, but I know that if I call Barbara, she'll listen to me she'll help me find the right answer. And I don't have to start from ground zero to explain my situation. I can just go from, let me bring you up to date since the last time we were together. So that's a different conversation and a different level of trust. And when I left, I was told that they could not hire. There was a hard freeze. They did eventually, I think, hire somebody part-time. That person came from the sheriff's office. So quite naturally, their orientation toward mental health would be totally different. A lot of the boarding care homes closed over the years.
And what year did you take your early retirement?
I left in 89, 90.
Okay.
It took a while for me to actually get all the paperwork done.
You're raising your family, you're tending to your life, and now you wander back in. You got back involved because people either asked you or they were...
They would come up to me in the strangest places. Like I could be in the one that sticks in my mind as I was in the market. And this lady comes up to me that I kind of know, but not well. I mean, we're not buddies. And she says, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's talk. She says, oh, no, not here. I'm like, oh, okay. I don't know what this is about. So anyway, we got together. She gave me like this big confession, her head bowed and tearing, to confess to me that she has a son that has serious mental illness and she doesn't know what to do. And she's tried, umpteen things and nothing has worked. And they've thrown all kinds of money at it and nothing has worked. So that's kind of how I got re-involved, to give them suggestions and they go out and look for them. And then they come back to me and say, we took your suggestion. We couldn't find what you were talking about. So then I'm like, what? So then I said, okay, let me come with you. And that was when I saw, oh my goodness, there is nothing here. No wonder they can't find anything. There's nothing to find. And in my community, of course, we have no support services for adults that have serious mental illness.
And what community is that?
I live in Santa Clarita. So in order for a person to get better, it's not enough to just get a diagnosis and get a prescription. That's just the beginning. Then you have to have something for the person to do during the day. And hopefully that's going to help them to get better and reconstitute so they can get on with their life at a level that they're wanting to get it to. Well, that's not going to happen if they're sitting home all day smoking because there's nothing to do except watch cartoons. So in Santa Clarita, what that means is that they have to be willing to move out of the area. That's a hard sell because people come to Santa Clarita for very specific reasons. But when we do move them, they have to go to a place that can monitor their medications. Well, that takes us to a licensed boarding care home. No other agency is authorized to lock, store, and dispense medications other than a licensed boarding care home, which we're, by the way, losing all the time. So this is how I ended up back with boarding care homes, because I had known some of those boarding care facilities in the 80s. And they were pristine with flowers and the staff was enthusiastic and we had a tiered reimbursement system. So some of them were getting additional funding for providing additional staffing. And, it was a very enthusiastic time and people were getting better and moving on to other levels of care. Some of those levels of care actually, again, we create something from nothing. That's our motto. Some of those boarding care operators actually purchased apartment buildings so that their clients could graduate and go to a place where they would have their own room and they could still come back to the boarding care home for dinner after work and kind of check in. So they didn't have, that dire loneliness, like, what am I going to do now? So it kind of worked, it provided an incentive for the people that were in boarding care because now they could see that boarding care does not mean a life sentence. People get better and they move on. And it also provided support so that if a person has moved on, they have a bridge to come back to where they know people. What is this, that song from Cheers? Everybody knows your name.
Knows your name.
And everybody knows their name. And they go, hi, how's it going? So it just worked. And all of that fell apart.
So as you're moving into your early retirement, you're remembering these board and care homes that have flowers, that have enthusiastic staff, probably pretty decent food. Now you are coming back with an interest of helping people, helping families find places for their loved ones to live. You're actually maybe walking back into some of these board and care homes 20 years later
Yep.
And what are you finding, and why are you finding them to be so financially destitute? What happened?
Lack of funding. Lack of funding. You could just nail it down to that one line. Lack of funding from the federal level, lack of funding then from the state level, and then, of course, that affects the county level. And I don't like to pay attention to money. It's really a money issue.
Okay, so let's do a little definition here. We talk a lot about, especially as we think about homelessness, we talk about housing, we talk about permanent supportive housing for people leaving homelessness, entering into a supportive housing with services. You can live alone, you can live in an apartment. There really has not been much discussion about board and care homes, or what also might be called adult residential facilities. Tell us how they are paid for. How do people pay that rent? And what has been the stagnation in that revenue stream over the past, 5-7 years, then you've jumped back into this?
Well, you will recall that when these homes were originally authorized to exist, financial improvement, making money, was a non-issue. It was truly just about giving service to a needy population. We served at that time two distinct populations. These homes were authorized to serve people with developmental disabilities and people with mental disabilities. So once the regional centers were created to serve people with developmental, or what's now called intellectual disabilities, our whole state agency transferred all of those cases to those new regional centers for servicing. In today's world, boarding care homes that serve this population, the residents still pay the boarding care rate that they get in their SSI, or which stands for Supplemental Security Income, or their Social Security Disability. But there's a gap that is paid by regional center. So those facilities, therefore, are always getting a minimum that's at least $85 per diem, and mostly higher than that. But on the mentally disabled side, that didn't happen. So the boarding care operators that choose to serve adults with mental disabilities are only reimbursed from the residents' SSI. There's no additional. Now, what they have been doing as a stopgap measure is something called enriched payments, which also known as patches. Some boarding care homes are getting that for some residents. But what is needed is an across-the-board raise so that everybody gets at least, $100 a night. And if everybody got $100 a night, that would be about $3,000 a month. Most boarding care homes say they could make it with that.
So for those who have not been following this crisis, and I consider you to be one of the leaders who have sounded the alarm on this for the past several years, the basic rate for a board and care operator from a person with a mental illness is $35 a day. That's before you might get this patch, or before you might get this enriched rate, which you have been instrumental in helping to push for. But I just want the listeners to think about that. Let's say you and I, Barbara, decided we're going to open up, which we would not do, but let's just say, let's open up a board and care, and let's bring in 6 people, and they're going to pay us $35 a day. What do we have to provide them with that $35 a day?
Well, I'm so happy you asked, because that is codified by law. It is not, up to you or me what we decide to do. The licensing regulations are quite specific. They can be found in the Welfare and Institutions Code's Title 22. And Title 22 says that we must provide 3 meals a day and 2 healthy snacks. And we can only have 2 people per room, no matter the size of the room. We must provide a clean, habitable place. So that means housekeeping must be provided. We have to provide certain kinds of safety mechanisms, and it has to be posted. So in case of emergency, we have to be able to get everyone out of the building, in an orderly fashion. So we have to have trainings on that. And of course, we have to collect all medications and keep it all locked in a central place and stored and administered by the dose. And we have to also have 24-hour care and supervision. So that means that somebody has to be awake most all the time for $35 a day.
And so what has been the trend with respect to the number of board and care beds available in LA County to serve this population over the past 3 to 5 years in your observation?
We're losing beds. We went from losing beds to now we're bleeding beds. I was in a meeting just last Friday with a representative from Supervisor Barger's office, which is my supervisor. And she's been always very supportive of mental health. As she says, Barbara, help me with the NIMBYism. So we have, huge gaps in mental health services, and we have no boarding care homes. And one of the workers that was in that meeting stated that she has a client that she had to place. Imagine that Santa Clarita is at what they call North County. The closest boarding care home that she could find that was licensed, because she's required to place in a licensed facility, is in a town called Linwood. Nothing wrong with Linwood. But from Linwood to Santa Clarita on a daily basis, really? With our transportation system? I mean, they worked out some kind of a deal where I think Medi-Cal provides an Uber to take this client back and forth twice a day. So these are the straits. I had a family call me the other day because they have a family member that was placed in a facility in West Covina. And again, from West Covina to Santa Clarita is a good little jump. The lady who called me is in her 70s. And she's like, I don't think I can drive to West Covina often enough to visit her. And I don't want her to feel like we don't care about her. So these are the kinds of issues that come up as we are experiencing this constant shrinkage of available beds.
It was around this issue that you and I met several years ago. And I do believe you have been a tireless voice, and there are positive things beginning to happen, including the county finally keeping an inventory of beds, which surprisingly had not even been done.
Well, they couldn't do it. One of the ways that you cut services, when you can't provide services, you find creative ways to continue to provide the most essential services. So if your most essential service is to keep a person from jumping off a bridge, you don't necessarily focus on how are you going to buy computers. Yeah. And we didn't have a statewide system. Thanks to AB 1766, we're only now going to begin to have data available online.
We could actually do a whole separate conversation on the board and care crisis, but I'm glad that we at least dipped our toe into this so that our listeners can begin to educate themselves. And I will include information in our episode notes that will bring people current, including the report that you and I and Caroline Kelly and Brittany Wiseman co-authored a couple years ago on this topic, which I'm very proud of that collective effort. But let's come very current right now as we bring this to a close. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you did end up starting a service, mental health hookup. I always think, hearing your story, you ended up starting a service now in your post-retirement career that emulates what you did as a state-supported psychiatric social worker in the 70s, because people desperately still need to navigate this system, and it's hard. Yes. So tell us a little bit about mental health hookup and your aspirations for how this might be transformed into a more robust service for families, and your desire. You've been working so hard your whole career, Barbara. Once quarantine lifts, you really need to get on an airplane and go to like the south of France or something and get.
I would love it. Yes, I'm up for that.
So tell us about mental health hookup.
So mental health hookup is an outgrowth, as you said. I started just out helping people, helping other parents that had a secret. So, it needed to be very confidential and low visibility. And so that was kind of how it started. Over time, we've grown, not nearly enough. But what I hope will come out of it is present time information. I hear that the buzzword is data. We have some limited data, but we don't have the numbers because I'm only one person. So it would be wonderful if we could ever get a pilot project of, say, 100 or 200 people. And really, maybe that would provide enough data that hopefully this can translate into public policy of how we do business. I hear Dr. Sharon talk, who is the head of county mental health, and he sings my song. It's like when he talks, it's like, oh, I love that man, because he talks about things like getting rid of documenting every 15 minutes. Because if you're with a client, who is going to stop and go, well, now, how long did I spend with him? Was it 15 minutes or was it 17 minutes? You just do the work that needs to be done. And let's start to talk about where the person is when we get them and what do we do with them to get them better, and do they get better? And the answer is yes. People with serious mental illness can and do get better. And that is something that I think has gotten lost in the shuffle of measuring the utilization review teams and the this and the that with the numbers. There's a belief that people that have serious mental illness don't need to have individual therapy. I would argue that that is so wrong. Why are we denying them the right to have individual therapy? Well, because it doesn't make money, because it takes too long. So if it takes too long and it doesn't make money, then we don't fund it. And what we now know that which is not funded does not happen. So perhaps I would like my dream, I guess, like Martin Luther King, he had a dream. Mine is a little bit smaller. My dream is that we in California, we know that we have a history of doing great things. So let's reclaim what we already know how to do. We don't have to rebuild a bicycle. We can just take an old rusty bicycle, sand it off, and paint it. And that's really what I'm trying to do with Mental Health Hookup, is to remind California this was a model that we had that was cost effective. Even Governor Reagan said this is the most cost effective, highest quality service he had ever seen. And so with that, he disbanded it. But he did admit that it was high quality. And one of my big concerns is the lack of oversight for people that have serious mental illness. We have a tendency in today's time to kind of conflate everybody that's homeless, the mentally ill, homeless, alcoholic addict. They're all like one person. Well, I would argue that there are many people that have serious mental illness that don't have a drop of alcoholism or addiction, but who can be taken advantage of by people who are, I call them hip, slick, and cool. And there's no one looking out for them. There's no one protecting them. We have people that come up with the Church of Sunshine, and they decide to be somebody's payee, and now they're getting that person's money. And who is looking out for that person? We used to do that.
Yeah.
We used to make sure that our clients didn't get taken advantage of.
Barbara, your heart is just so huge. And, I just see evidence of it in your entire career, thinking about those children who weren't able to go to school, tackling that as your master's thesis, feeling the overwhelm of having your fingers in the dike as you were caught in the crosshairs of a mental health case management, like safety net that was being unraveled, taken apart, and you could not obviously meet all the needs of the people that were coming to you. And then re-entering this, 20 years later, seeing board and care homes in a shambles and having families come to you desperate, trying to navigate a system that is so fragmented. And your heart has always been what has inspired me as well. I will encourage people, and we'll include this in the episode notes, to look into Mental Health Hookup. You have transformed it now into a nonprofit.
Yes.
The goal is to actually expand this level of service and coordination for families who are looking to find ways to assist their loved ones. And you have a board of directors now. And this is a great way if listeners want to do something very meaningful to support Mental Health Hookup and to learn about the things that we talked about today. And last thing, I'm going to ask this question before we sign off. What is your hope quotient? Like, are you hopeful that we can put that tricycle back together again? What is your sense of optimism for the future?
My optimism is unfortunately tied to the politics of the moment. I think that if we are successful in retaining Governor Newsom, and the reason I say that is because Governor Newsom is the only governor that I'm aware of that has ever left his office in Sacramento and traveled out into the community and talked to residents in a boarding care home, talked to the owners of the boarding care home. So he understands, he has a mental picture now of what a boarding care home is, what it does, and he wants to help them. He also has a real sense of the urgency that families are feeling by not having any kind of real continuum of care. So it's not just boarding care homes that we need. We need a continuum of care, housing options for people that have serious mental illness. Our best hope for getting that is if we can have Governor Newsom, not to be political, but let's just say Governor Newsom is out of office tomorrow and we get a new person there. That person has to learn the job. We have a guy already here. I'm like a bird in the hand. Come on, people. Let's not lose this opportunity to have funding dedicated. And that's what has to happen, is that we have to have dedicated funding for mental health. We see what happens when states are given money and each state gets to decide what they're going to do with that money. That was President Reagan's idea with that bundle thing that he did. Block grants.
Block grants, yeah.
So he gave every state a bundle of money, called them block grants. In 3 years, we started to see homeless adults with serious mental illness. And that wasn't even in California. This was in Ohio. Research was done. So we know that if a state has to choose between spending money on people that have serious mental illness and spending it in other ways, they're going to choose other ways.
Yeah, I don't give up hope. And
I don't.
I tend to agree. I don't know why we would change horses in the middle of the stream especially in the midst of a pandemic. Barbara, you are a treasure. I have so enjoyed this time together today, and you continue to inspire me. And I thank you so much for being so generous to talk with me today.
Well, I thank you so much for having me, Carrie, and so much for the work that you do. I hear in the streets, I have clients that know you, and I hear from them how highly they respect you and how excited they are with your project. So I hear on the back end that you are inspiring people.
Thank you so much. I hope you picked up on the reality that Barbara has created now through her nonprofit, Mental Health Hookup, a support team that emulates what she did under employ to the state of California in the 1970s. The need for good old-fashioned social work never magically disappeared. We just stopped valuing this as a true need of people. And we are grateful to Barbara for sounding the alarm on the slow but steady erosion of the board and care beds in LA County due to the ridiculously low reimbursement rate of $35 a day. Gratefully, county and state leaders have taken heed, and measures are being implemented to shore up this housing resource. But the wheels of government can only move so fast, and even this year we are still losing beds. If you are interested in learning more about Mental Health Hookup and want to connect with Barbara and her work, please look for those links in the episode notes. Next week, I hope you will come back to hear an interview with a professor from NYU who has spent several years researching the system in California that oversees how and under what conditions people who are gravely disabled are placed under a conservatorship. His findings may surprise you. Thank you for the support that you give this podcast, and thank you to my partners at Pure Mental Health for their technical collaboration in producing the podcast, with a special shout out to my editor, Paul Robinson. I will see you next week.